Hey, my name's Brent. Welcome to 49cc Scoot. Today I'm going to be installing the over-range transmission on the RC1, as well as getting the CVT cover and the kickstart components together. There's a whole lot of stuff here, so we better get going. But real quick, I will tell you that not all of these parts are included with the RC1 or the Malossi over-range kit. There are a few things that you're going to need, and I will try to point those out individually as they come up in the installation process. So to begin, I'm going to start by setting up the rear pulley. At very least, you're going to need to install a couple of seals and pins inside of the torque driver, and you're going to have to grease that. But I also advise doing some pre-assembly checks because while we tend to think this is a well-engineered racing part here and everything's good to go, sometimes there are actually restrictions with this right out of the box if you just install it and aren't paying attention. I'm going to remove this little plastic cap that protects the threads, and then I can pull off this torque driver cover or spring base, and then I need to install these 3 pins into the torque driver. You've got 2 different sets of grooves that you can choose from in here. One is marked with a dot on top of it, and the other set has no dot over top of them. So that makes it easy to know which one you're in at the moment. Malossi says to start with A, which I believe is the dotted one here. So while it shouldn't really matter for this check, I'm just going to go ahead and align the dotted groove with the actual pin slots there. So you'll see there's small holes in here, and then there are larger holes. And the larger holes are the ones that actually hold the pins. So I'm just going to get that aligned and then try to drop a pin inside of there. Obviously the small side of the pin is going to go in first. You may have to wiggle it around a little bit until you find the spot where it actually fits. And then continue that for the remaining 2 spots. I'm not going to worry about any grease or my seals now. Again, this is just some pre-assembly checking here. So for right now, I'm just going to go ahead and put this in place over top of there, and that's good enough. I want to check the travel of the rear pulley, specifically the opening, because if you're looking at the top and you look at this center section here, so just to separate the two, here's the center section, and then you've got the seal and the torque driver, and they are sitting above this center section. So the clutch is going to install, and it's going to seat right here on the center section. If that's seated right there, then there's no way that this seal and the torque driver can go past that point, aside from if your clutch was designed to raise up outside of that area, but most of them are just flat here. So you can see that if you put something flat across here, it would limit the travel by about that much. So this is probably where it would stop with something flat on there, and then you'd have that much travel you could get out of it. Another possibility is that the bottom of your clutch will run into the outer face here of your pulley. So same effect, if this is trying to come up and the bottom of the pulley gets in the way, it's going to restrict how far this can move. So we want to look out for both of these when we do this check. To do the check, you're going to need to put the clutch on top of the rear pulley. I should mention here that I'm using the Stage 6 torque control clutch. The Malossi Delta clutch, I believe it is the one that will be included with the RC1 kit. I didn't buy the kit as a whole. I pieced it together, so I went with this because I really like this clutch. Not saying anything bad about the Malossi clutch, but I'm familiar with this one and I like it a lot. So one thing about this clutch is that it is very tight here on the inside, to the point that it's rubbing right up against the threads here, and it's actually kind of difficult to install sometimes. So what I did was I just lightly sanded the inside here, and I'm not removing material really. Basically, I just removed the paint or the coating on there, and that's enough to allow it to be installed a little bit easier. Because if it's super tight, like it tends to come out of the box, you can't even really do this check and tell what's happening because it won't lift the clutch up off of the pulley. So got to make sure this is all the way down and seated. Again, if your clutch is really tight against there, it's going to be kind of tough. But make sure the clutch is right up against the base underneath of there. Then all you've got to do is rotate your rear pulley to open it, And you can see just with light pressure it stops here, but if I continue to open it, it's going to pop my clutch off of there. So you can see it picks that clutch up. And you can tell even with it lightly sanded, it's still pretty snug on there. But it's picking the clutch up. So if it has to pick the clutch up in order to get full travel, obviously it's never going to get full travel when this clutch is bolted down. The next step is to figure out exactly why this is happening. So why is it that the clutch is being picked up by the rear pulley or moved by the rear pulley? In my case, I've already pointed out that I can see when this is all the way open that this outer section, the seal and the torque driver, are above the level of this center section here of the pulley. So with that being the case, there's just no way that it can possibly open all the way because it's going to restrict it. So there are basically two ways that you can deal with that. The first way would be to machine down the top of this torque driver so that when the pulley was all the way open, the top of that torque driver matched up with the top of this center section, or maybe was slightly below it. And then once you did that, you'd have to use either a lathe or you could grind it down, just being very careful to be even. Then you would have to reinstall your seal. Obviously you don't do that with a seal installed. So you'd have to reinstall your seal, and then you can take a razor blade and shave the seal down again to match both of those. I've done this in the past on Minarellis, so it's definitely possible, and I even did it before I had a lathe. The other way is to use a spacer or a shim right here on this ledge, and that will raise the clutch up above the rest of the pulley, and you'd want that spacer or shim to make sure that the top of the spacer was at least level with the top of this outer stuff here. That way it wouldn't be a restriction for sure. If you decide to shave down the top of the torque driver and the seal, well, the torque driver modification is pretty permanent. I mean, you can't put that material back. However, it probably won't matter as long as it seals. One big issue could be that when you modify that seal, it may cause it not to seal, and then obviously you've kind of ruined that setup. So that's a potential problem there. The one potential negative here when you use a shim, well, first off, to my knowledge, they aren't sold commonly. I don't know why, because it's a pretty common problem. At least some people that I've spoken to also are aware of it. But I don't know of any kits that are just sold or any shims that are just sold to alleviate that out of a box. Like, I'm surprised Malossi or one of these companies don't sell their own. But so the first problem is just getting one or making one or finding one, whatever. The other problem is that anytime you put anything up here to shim that up, you could be eliminating a few of the threads that you have to lock into with the clutch nut. So you don't want to just use an overly large spacer there, because you're going to cause yourself problems. If you don't have enough threads there, then you could damage the thread, strip it out, and then you may ruin the whole rear pulley, and that thing is pretty expensive to buy on its own or in the kit, whatever. Also, if you just space it up too high, then your clutch is going to stick out too far, and then it's going to cause clearance issues elsewhere. So once you space this up, then you have to space the clutch bell out, and then you start running out of threads on the primary shaft. So you really do need to be pretty precise if you're going to use a spacer here. If you'll be using a shim or a spacer here, then you need to know the dimensions. So the first one being the outside dimension, easy enough. It should match up to mine, but measure yours anyway. It's about 34 millimeters, a little shy of it, and it's important that whatever shim you get or spacer is that size or smaller. So if the spacer then hangs out here over the side of this, it creates the same problem that your clutch does, and it causes the pulley to stop when it tries to go up there. So it needs to be 34 millimeters or a little bit smaller than that. Then for the inside diameter, just measure the widest point that you can find across the threads anywhere, especially on the bottom. And that's, for me, 28.15 millimeters. So 28.15 or slightly larger, very slightly larger for the inside diameter, and just a little bit shy of 34 millimeters for the outside diameter. To determine the thickness that you'll need of the spacer, make sure this is all the way up to the top of its travel and hold it there, and then you're going to try to measure the difference in height between the center section and the outer section at its highest point. So I'm just going to use my digital calipers, and I'm going to take a few measurements all the way around here. Alright, so I measured around there multiple times, and the highest number that I saw was 1.15 millimeters. So ideally, if I want the max clearance, I'm going to need a 1.15 or just barely larger, thicker spacer. So 34, just a little smaller than 34 OD, just a little bit larger than 28 ID, and for me, about 1.15 or a little larger in thickness. Lucky for me, this happens to match up with the Minarelli overrange and other Minarelli pulleys, so I've already got some spacers here roughly machined. I say roughly machined because there's a whole lot of rough edges from me parting them, but they're mostly ready to go. And I've cut these in different thicknesses. For one thing, for me it's pretty tough to cut these to one thickness because my little mini lathe is not rigid enough that it will always cut exactly how I'd like it to. But also it's good to have a selection because you don't always need the exact same thing. So pretty much I've just got to go through here and find the one that matches up the closest, or I could cut a new one if I have to, but to be honest with you, it's a pretty long process to get this done, so I'm hoping one of these is close. I found this one in my pile that looks like it'll be pretty close, showing up, depending exactly where I measure it, around 1.2 or a little bit less, so that should be pretty much spot on for me. Only problem is it's really rough there from my parting, so I just had to clean that up. This one fits pretty well. You can see it's not really tight, but it doesn't just fall into place either. And it's just barely smaller than the OD here of the pulley in the center. Now I can set my clutch on top of there and make sure it's seated all the way down as far as it's going to go. Then I can do the same check that I tried before, but this time it's not picking the clutch up anymore. Here's where we get into compromise. So this is the nut that would be used to tighten the clutch down to the rear pulley. If I set that down there, you should be able to see that now there's not enough of the threads of the rear pulley sticking through to even use all of this nut. Ideally, we would use all the threads in here. I mean, this is a very thin nut as it is. So it comes down to how much you're willing to compromise. If you would like the most reliable setup that you have to worry about the least, then you want full purchase here. You would like the threads on this to be able to go all the way flush with the end of this nut, or at least very close to it. And the higher you raise this and the less threads you've got, the more likely you are to have strip threads or problems in the future. The other thing is you can cause clearance issues again by raising the clutch up too high. Then it's going to start running into other stuff. Then the bell needs to be further out, etc. So I'm just going to install this hand tight for now. I want to continue my mock-up by putting this onto the primary drive shaft here and sliding that all the way in. Then I'm going to take the clutch bell, slide that on top of there, and I can at least see on the Piaggio you've got a lot of threads here, whereas on the Minarelli engines that I'm used to, there's a minimum amount of threads and you can really run into a lot of problems just by spacing things out. So it doesn't look like that's so much an issue. Another check is to hold some pressure against the clutch bell. You could actually install the nut. I'm just going to hold pressure for now and then try to rotate the rear pulley. And I'm getting a lot of friction there. So you can see if I just do this, the friction from the clutch bell against the clutch is stopping that rear pulley. Show you the difference. Now if I were just to spin this, it spins much more easily. So clearly there's a problem here, and actually I think it must have made the mark inside of here. Not 100% sure if that was there before or not, but probably not. So again, try to spin it. I can hear it, and it's just obvious that this is hanging up. Now the way to deal with that is Malossi supplies a few spacers. So I believe there's another one in there. Yeah, there's 3 of these little spacers, and they are for dealing with this. So you can start by putting one on here, and that's going to space the clutch bell out away from the clutch and everything else. So I'll try one, and I'll do the same check. That already feels more free to me. So you notice now with pressure on there, it's not stopping that rear pulley. To be 100% certain of what you got going on there, you can actually install the nut and then tighten it. Now, I'm not going to worry about a torque spec. I just want to get this thing snugged down a bit. I can hear contact there, but I think that must be between the shoes or something else. To be totally sure, I'm going to try to remove this, and now I've got it tight enough that I can't get it off. Luckily, I've got a holding tool, and I'll put one more under there and we'll see if we still hear that noise or not. Well, I just figured out that the noise that I was hearing was my spring base in there because it's not secured, so that's actually touching something. So it looks like for me, one spacer should be enough. So now I know these details for when I actually assemble this thing later. Again, the main thing that you've got to figure out if you want to compromise is, do you want to reduce the spacing a little bit under there and give yourself some more threads up here? So you can see exactly what you're dealing with. This is how it looks with a 1.2 millimeter spacer under there, just hand tight. And then there it is with no spacer, and that is basically flush, which in a lot of ways is ideal. But again, the pulley is going to run into the clutch. So it's your call exactly what you want to do here. You may want to actually do some tests before and after and find out if it really makes much of a difference for you, because maybe it doesn't. You can also install your clutch on here and then open this up and put your belt down in there, and you can look at how far down the belt can travel. Now be aware that Malossi puts a little bit of grease in here right from the factory. So don't get your belt in that grease. If you're going to do this, you'll want to clean that off first. And then you can switch up the setup with a spacer, reinstall the clutch, and see how much difference it's actually making down there if you think it's worth it. Also, if you get this thing together and you put a spacer in there, if you find that the RPM drops a little too much for you on the top end, then it may be that it would work out better without the spacer in there. But first, you'll probably want to try swapping the slots around in your torque driver, see if that works. Then try taking the spacer out of there and see if that helps. Now that I've got the rear pulley setup mostly figured out, I want to disassemble it. So take off this spring cup or spring base, and I'm going to try to get these pins out of here. Usually you can just kind of roll it over so the pin is facing down and then wiggle this back and forth and they'll just fall out most of the time. There they go. And then this should come off of there. And I'll need to grease this, but Malossi has put their own grease on here. Not exactly sure why they put that there, unless just to make sure that it's got something on it while it's traveling. But I want to get this stuff off of here. So first, I'm just going to go over it and wipe the excess off with a rag. Same here. They haven't put enough in there to actually be useful for assembling it and riding with it, but they've just got a little bit of grease in there, and it's not the same stuff that they supply to use in there. Now I want to continue the cleaning process and be sure I've got all of the grease residue off of here. So I want to talk to you a little bit about cleaning CVT parts. Brake parts cleaner is one of the most popular cleaners for CVTs, and that's what I use for the majority of my scooter experience up until somewhat recently, the last couple of years maybe. And the reason that I've changed it up is because I've had a couple of setups that go through drive belts very, very quickly. I'm talking 100, 200 miles. I can be breaking a drive belt from brand new. So very, very accelerated, rapid wear. And due to that, I've done a lot of research because I wanted to figure out what was happening and if there was anything that I could change. In the process, I found that brake parts cleaner is not recommended by belt manufacturers, and generally scooter manufacturers, when they do service manuals and such, like my T-Max for example, don't recommend brake parts cleaner. So A lot of us know that brake parts cleaner can be very, very harmful to rubber and plastic parts. And of course, our belts fall somewhere into that category. So most of us wouldn't spray a drive belt directly with brake parts cleaner. We'd know it's a really bad idea because it could have a negative effect. It could dry it up, etc. But apparently the manufacturers of some of these belts, like I believe it was Gates I read it from, I'm not 100% sure, but I think it was Gates that said don't even clean your drive faces and such with it because you don't want anything left over. Now, I generally think of brake parts cleaner as not leaving any residue. That's when you assemble brakes, the last thing you want is any kind of oily residue or residue on your brakes. So brake parts cleaner is very good for not leaving residue, but I'm guessing that they either think that we're going to spray drive belts with it directly while we're cleaning the CVT and it's an abundance of caution, or they've determined that it's just a bad idea to have it in contact with pulley surfaces at all. Maybe there is something that it leaves behind that could be harmful for the rubber belt. So, out of caution, I've switched it up. Some people do use carburetor cleaner. One thing about carburetor cleaner is that it is much less harmful to most rubber and plastic. It doesn't have the same effect on them that brake parts cleaner does. One negative is that carburetor cleaner could leave behind residue, although it's usually pretty good, in my opinion, for cleaning a lot of stuff. So like when I was cleaning the gearbox in the last video, I like to use carburetor cleaner on a toothbrush when I'm scrubbing some areas because I've got seals in there, I don't want to remove them, and I know that the carburetor cleaner should be pretty safe around the seals where I'd rather not expose them to brake parts cleaner. I still don't use that because what I've seen recommended more than anything is kerosene. And Malossi actually says gasoline to clean parts, though they don't specifically say it about the CVT parts to my knowledge. I haven't done extensive reading from Malossi there, but I know that manufacturers often recommend to use kerosene to clean these parts, so that's what I've been using. For me, it works out because I heat the garage in the winter with kerosene if I'm going to use any kind of heat, so I usually have a little bit around, and it has worked well so far. So I've just got a little kerosene and a rag, nice clean rag. Get a little kerosene on there with any of this stuff, wear the right protective stuff, and of course most of it is flammable, so be cautious, but just going to clean the surfaces up here, make sure I've got everything off of there, and then I can finish that off with a dry clean rag. And if you want to exercise an abundance of caution, you can even finish this up with something like rubbing alcohol. We know that's also good about removing anything left on a surface. Dries very quickly, so you can also wipe it down with that if you'd like. Set that aside. And now I'm going to wipe this one down. Same thing for the spring base, as well as the little pins, even though these don't have any grease on them that I can really see. Just make sure they're nice and clean for assembly. Another thing that works great is to clean them with just plain old dish soap and water, and then you can just dry them off with compressed air, and that way you know it's safe. Now it's time for assembly, and I'm going to go ahead and use Malossi's grease. This is different than what I've seen in the past. This could actually be what they had in there before, so maybe I was incorrect. I'm used to the last overrange kits I've bought had their black grease, which is like, I believe it's a Molly grease. And I haven't really liked it a lot, even though I love Bel Ray's Molly grease, which they no longer make. But anyway, I'll use this, and I'm going to smear it all around here and try to make sure I get a little in those pin areas and the holes there. And there's no point of putting a whole lot on here, but I just want to film, because if you put a whole lot, the seals on the torque driver are basically going to wipe it clean anyhow. So I'm just starting with a film. Now for the torque driver itself, the only place that I want to apply any grease is inside of here. So there's kind of a recess in there, and I just want to try and get grease all inside, and especially in the recess there. I want to put plenty inside of there. I don't want to get grease on either one of these pulleys. because obviously that's what we were just talking about, the cleaning process. We don't want all that stuff left behind, a bunch of residue. It's going to do nothing but cause belt slip and headaches. And I do also want to just grease the lip of each one of these seals. Not necessarily the outside, but just the inside of each seal, top and bottom. Now I'm going to make sure I don't have a bunch of grease on the pulley out here. And I've also cleaned my gloves off a little bit so I don't have grease all over me. And I'm going to slide the torque driver here over the fixed half of the rear pulley. You can see some grease pushing out there, that's totally fine. Now you need to install all three of the pins for the torque driver, and we talked about before that there are two sets of angles, so once you've chosen which one you want to use, again, Malossi says to start with the A angle, which should be the dotted one. Then you take a pin, you get a little grease, and rub that onto the pin. Get this all aligned, and then insert the pin in there. Now this is the third one for me because I actually did the others and didn't realize I hadn't hit record on the camera, but just repeat that all the way around till you've got all three drive pins in place. Now you should have an orange and a black seal from the kit, and both of those need to go on here. So if you look at them, one is a little bit larger than the other. That's the black one, is a little bit larger. That one needs to go in the bottom. There's a little groove down there for it. And then the orange one will go up here up top in this groove. So before those go on, again, a little bit of grease, some residue here, and I'm going to rub that into each one of the O-rings to prep them. So I'll just start with the top one, move that down a little bit, and then just sort of work it into the groove pretty easily. Make sure it's seated. Same deal for the bottom one, get a little grease, rub that in, and then slide that all the way down. And get it seated in the groove all the way in the bottom. Now we want to make sure we've got plenty of grease inside there. So what we're going to do is take the grease and basically fill up all of these grooves. So you should be able to kind of squirt it in there and just move it around. I mean, you don't have to worry about packing it or anything, but this is basically just a supply of grease for this pulley to operate. So just spin it around and keep doing that, and even put it in these. I don't like to pack it very much in the grooves where the pin is actually moving, because I feel like it's going to push it out so much anyway. Your call how much you really want to try to get in there. But the empty ones I definitely pack. Well, not pack. I'm not trying to put pressure in there and pack them, but fill them. Any of the excess that's just hanging out, falling out of these grooves and whatnot, is basically going to be pushed off, probably into areas we don't want it when we try to install the spring base on there. So go around there and try to just make sure everything is sort of level. I also like to take a clean rag or something and try to wipe off any grease outside of the O-ring areas. So the O-ring seal down there, anything outside past that seal toward the outside edge, we don't want on the pulley. So that's a good area to clean up. And if you've got any kind of excess, again, outside of this O-ring seal up top, clean that off as well. Pretty much anything outside those seals is going to be slung out. So that's why we don't want it. Now I'm going to take my spring base and carefully install this. If it takes a lot of force, something's wrong. You don't have a seal or an O-ring seated in there. So go back and double check. Just work that all the way down. And give it a little twist usually while I push to make sure it's seated. And then if you're seeing any excess after that's gone on, make sure you wipe that off as well. Residue is totally fine. You're actually going to want some grease residue on this shaft, but you don't want to see grease just hanging off. This part of the pulley is almost ready, but I want to work this open and closed all the way a few times. Make sure it feels totally smooth. If not, you should disassemble it and see why it doesn't feel smooth. But that feels good. Now the other thing I like to do is, if you look inside of here, you can see that there is a bunch of grease now left over. And again, I'm fine with residue, but I don't want to see any sort of buildup of grease because that's going to sling right out there onto these drive faces. So I'm going to go ahead and clean that off. And you got to be really careful not to get this on the drive faces when you clean it off. If you do get something on there, then you may want to go back and clean the drive faces again. Now that's pretty clean. I know there's going to be more residue on there, but I'm going to work this open and closed a few more times. Because if you've got excess grease inside of this pulley, then it's going to end up accumulating out here. So that's why I work this open and closed, and then I will go back and clean off if it looks like excess to me. Not a whole lot that time, but I'll do it again. And this time I just see residue. I don't see a bunch of grease building up in there. So to me, that's pretty much good to go. The only thing I'm probably going to do is go back through and wipe off both drive faces to be sure I don't have any grease on those. Now I'm going to install my Contra Spring or torque spring. And what I'll do with these, I'm going to assume that Malossi should face up, but I don't know. Sometimes one side of the spring is a little bigger than the other and it fits better than the other will. So in this case, this is a really tight fit in there. And it turns the whole spring base. And if I flip it upside down, that fits a lot better and it will rotate. So I would go with that, but before I decide, I'll also grab the clutch and just make sure that the other end of the spring fits into the clutch nicely. It does. So I will go with the side that fits in here and rotates smoothly. I'm going to put that in. I'm also going to install that spacer that we talked about earlier. I did decide to compromise a bit, and this is a 0.9 millimeter spacer. So a little bit thinner, but gives me just a small amount more clearance there for the threads. So this is my stage 6 torque control MK2 clutch. I'm not going to go over the setup of this in great detail because I've got an entire video all about setting this up and tuning it, and I think that does a better job than I'm going to do here. So I'll just tell you what I'm doing to it basically. So one of the things I'm going to do is you get all these little brass weights and they can go in here, actually in the clutch shoes there, and I'm going to install every one of those. That adds weight to the shoes, and I've always liked the feeling of a heavy clutch, so I'm going to go ahead and do that for this setup. I'm also going to swap out the springs because these come with white springs, which are the softest springs for the stage 6 lineup, and they also come with the orange springs, which are medium. And then I had to buy the red springs, which are the harder stiff springs. And usually this is for really, really mild stuff, the white springs. And then these go into, I guess, kind of sport and mid-race maybe. And you're almost definitely going to be at red springs if you've got a more racy setup. There's also purple springs. I think it was made by Maximum RPM. I've got those in my clutch on the TPR 86cc, and they are a little stiffer than these even. But this is what I have for this, so I'm going to swap in the red springs as well as all of these brass weights. In order to get the weights in there, you do have to totally remove the springs. That way the clutch shoes can fold open. So you've got to remove all the tension on the springs. One cool thing about this clutch is that the springs are all adjustable, so it makes it really easy to swap them out, but it also makes it so you can get it dialed in exactly how you want it. Then once it's really loose, you should be able to get in there and grab the clutch spring and just pull it out pretty easily. And you can see now I can fold this open. Clutch spring fell out. I've got these spots here, the 3 spots. I'll just push it open, put a brass weight in each one of those. And then I can kind of close it up. So push that all the way in to create the most slack that I can get for the spring. And then you can start the spring in whichever side works for you. I'm going to try to start it over here. All right, so once that's in there, I'm going to maneuver it into one end here. There we go. And then pull it over to the other end, which shouldn't take much effort if this is adjusted all the way out. And that's in there really easily. Then I just have to set the tension on here. So I'm going to screw this in until there's some tension so I don't have to hold it anymore. So now the spring's holding this and these aren't going to fall out. If you look in there, you can see a bunch of markings. So you basically are just going to screw that in until it's at the setting that you want. And you're pretty much just going to have to guess. So I'll just set it somewhere around halfway to begin with. And I'll have to tune that later as needed. And the main important thing here is I'm going to go around and do this to all of them. I'm going to put the same amount of weights in each one of these shoes. And I'm going to go for the same adjustment here on every one of the springs. You don't want any of the springs to be unequal. This is all set up now and ready to install. Before I do, I want to mention this kit comes with this ring. Sometimes this will go onto a Contra spring and it'll fit in there. In this case, you don't have to worry about it. It won't even fit on this Contra spring for the Piaggio. Right before this goes on, I am going to clean the clutch. Just go over it with brake parts cleaner, making sure I get the shoes on there, the pads. And while I'm at it, I'll also do the bell, specifically the inside of it. And I know I had mentioned brake parts cleaner before, not using it. However, if the belt comes in contact with the clutch or the clutch bell, I have much bigger problems than the belt wearing out a little bit. Now I'll set the clutch on top of the torque spring, and then you just have to figure out how you're going to compress this torque spring. So most of us, especially if you're working alone, are not just going to compress this and then be able to start the nut at the same time by hand. If you've got a friend around helping, not that bad. One person can compress it, the other can start the nut. You can buy or build a compressor tool, usually a threaded rod that's going to go all the way through the center, and then you'll have a washer or plate on the bottom, and then some sort of cap on the top that will allow you to access the nut through it, and there will be a nut on top of that on the threaded rod. You screw the nut on, and then it will compress this. But I'm going to do it the same way I've done it for years, which is just to use my feet. So I've got to take this over to a clean spot on the floor. Now I've got a 34mm socket handy because that's what fits this nut. And then I've got to align this because there's two flat sides on here that will match up with two flat sides on the pulley there. So now I'm just going to get my feet on the very edges of the pulley, the clutch. And I'm going to push that down. Twist it to align it, and then I can get this nut started on here. And sometimes with these, because they're tough to start, I like to rotate it counterclockwise for a second, and then when it feels right, go ahead and start spinning that on. At this point, I'm just going to get it tight by hand. Now I want to torque this to 50 to 55 Newton meters. So the Yamaha spec is 50, and this is the same size, same thread pulley that Yamaha uses. And the Piaggio spec is 55, so either one should work. I'm going to go the low end and go 50. You'll have to be able to hold it to torque it. So you could use like a strap wrench to go around the clutch. Just make sure it's nothing that's going to damage the pads here. You could use a holding tool that would lock into holes in the clutch if you have them. Just be careful with that. Don't put too much force on those because the faces of these clutches will warp anyway. That's known to happen. Not so much this one, the Stage 6, but I know with stock clutches it will happen. Or you can try to hold it down with your feet, but you got to be careful with that. Don't put too much pressure there. I'm going to try my feet. If that doesn't work, I'll figure something else out here. Yeah, that's not going to work. I actually prefer an oil filter wrench to a strap wrench if possible. The thing is, you have to have a big oil filter wrench or a really small clutch, one or the other. And I've never had problems with this damaging a clutch before. So you can just put that around there and make sure you're going in the proper direction to fight the force that you're going to put on it. And then you've just got to try to hold that while you torque it. There we go. Some people do like to put some lines through here to match up next time they take this apart and put it back together. If you're going to do that, put a line all the way through the center, the nut, and on the face of the clutch here. That way you've got all three of them. And you'll probably want to use a paint pen or something like that, because this marker is going to wear off. But I'm just trying to show you in case you want to do it. And then some people don't use torque. They will just go ahead and rotate these around till they feel pretty tight, and then all of them align, and then that's close enough. Now this assembly is almost ready to go onto the primary drive shaft. There's one more step that I take, and that is to get some grease. And I'm just using synthetic wheel bearing grease, and grease this bearing here in the rear. Try to pack it in there pretty good. And then wipe off any of the excess left over here on the outside. And now I can just slide this pulley onto the shaft. Make sure it spins freely. And remember, we had found the washers that we needed earlier. So we've got these three little shims. We should have came up with a number for how many we need. In my case, it should be just one. So I'll put that on there. And the clutch bell will push this the rest of the way on. You don't really have to worry about seating it. Then I'll take my clutch bell, align the splines there, and slide that on. Now you'll need a nut to secure this, and this is not included from Malossi. I picked this up from a Piaggio part dealer, but it's an M10 by 1.25 flange nut. Nothing too fancy there. Probably just as easy to pick it up from a Piaggio dealer as it is to buy though. Also, I picked this up, but I don't think I'm going to use it. This is a washer that was listed to go underneath of the nut there, but I don't really understand exactly why they wanted this to be so huge. It seems like I'm not sure if I got the right washer or not at that rate. So I'm just going to leave that off. This has plenty of area. Another one of the things that's kind of your call, I'm going to put a few drops of medium strength thread locker on here. This will affect torque to some degree if you're going to torque it to spec, but it's pretty standard practice. The clutch bell nut should be torqued to 40 to 44 Newton meters. And by the way, if you need torque specs, a quick reference, I set up a page all about the RC1 on my site. So if you go on there, this little menu here, you can see specs. You can click that, it'll take you right down. Just scroll down below the engine specs, and then we've got a whole lot of torque specs here. So it comes in really handy when you're trying to put one of these together. You'll need to be able to hold the clutch still so you can torque that. So again, a strap wrench. If you happen to have an oil filter wrench that's that big, you could try it. You can have one of those pin spanners maybe go in here. Multiple ways you could do it. If you've got the stage 6 bell, they actually make a tool just for it. So they've got little indentations here all around the bell, and this has this little peg that aligns with those. So you just put that on there, flip it around depending whether you're loosening or tightening. You put that on there, align that peg with one of those little spots in the bell, and then you can torque it down. We've got one more part that's not included from Malossi, and that is the little rings here. You only need one. I just picked up a few. But apparently these are called expander rings or something like that. And basically these are going to go around in this groove here. And you've got a bearing inside of the CVT cover. So this is going to go in there, and then I guess the little expander ring will make it a real nice tight or snug fit inside of that bearing. I'm going to take a pair of snap ring pliers, put those in there. These are the kind that you squeeze to expand, so you can see it's expanding that. And I'll expand it enough to get it started on there, and then I can just push that into place right back there. Pretty interesting idea. Probably something the Minerellis that I'm used to should have had as well. Next, I want to clean the Variator parts the same way that I described cleaning the rear pulley parts. But before I do that, I wanted to point out that you should get 2 ramp plates with the RC1 kit. So one's going to come with a crankshaft and one's going to come with the overrange kit. The one with the overrange kit is splined in the center. That's for a standard Piaggio engine. This one is smooth, and that is for the crank that the RC1 uses. So this one is not needed. You may want to add the belt to your cleaning list as well. Do not clean it with a kerosene or anything harsh. What I would do is just take it in the house and wash it with dish soap and water and then dry it off. Before I assemble the Variator, I'm going to put a couple of pieces on the crankshaft that act as spacers. So this one comes with a crank. It's a drive pulley. You do not need it because we're not going to have an oil pump or a water pump. Again, I'm not familiar with Piaggio engines, so I'm not even sure what it drove before, but there's a flat side and a side where you can actually see the teeth. Put the flat side on first, all the way up against the shoulder there. And then you should also have this spacer that comes with the overrange kit. Slide that on in front of that. This Variator is different than what you'll find on most small scooters. It's actually much more similar to the Variators on large scooters because it's got a seal in each side and it's meant to hold grease. And then there's also a passage here for holding grease inside of this bushing. And that should reduce the friction and wear between the drive boss and the Variator. So this needs to be greased now. I'm going to use what Malossi supplies. Same stuff I was using on the torque driver. So there's a little groove inside of here. And basically I'm just going to try to squirt this in, make sure I fill up that little groove. And I'm going to spread it all the way around. And this is just like the rear pulley where you really don't want the grease anywhere outside of the seals. So try to be careful to only get it inside of there, and anything you get on the outsides here, make sure you clean it off. I also want to be sure that I am getting some grease on each one of the seals. While I've already got grease on me, I'm also going to put some grease in this groove that goes around the drive boss. Go ahead and wipe off the excess from the outside, although honestly I'll be doing this again in a minute. I just like to kind of keep all the overflowing grease to a minimum. Malossi provides this little button looking thing here, and that is to go in the end of the drive boss. You may want to take just a little bit of grease and put that on there because it is going to help you get the drive boss into the Variator very easily without worrying about damaging a seal. So with that in place, I'll just go ahead and push my drive boss into the pulley and get that all the way through. You can see I'm pushing out excess grease now. That can be removed. And I'm getting this all over the place, so I'm going to have to clean the whole face of the pulley because I do not want grease on the face of the pulley. Clean up the excess back here as well. Before I worry about getting it too clean, I'm going to go ahead and work this through there a little bit, just back and forth. Everything feels good. I wanted to make sure, just like what I did with the torque driver, I want to see that it's not pushing a bunch of grease outside of there, and it's not. So now I can do a final clean of this. Now it's time to install weights in the Variator. And this comes with 2 sets of weights from Malossi. You've got 3.8 gram and 4.3 gram. So if you're going to use these, what I would suggest is to kind of start in the middle. So you would take a 3.8 and then a 4.3 and then a 3.8 and then a 4.3, another 3.8 and another 4.3. And then that averages out to, I believe it is 4.05 grams right in the middle. Then when you're tuning later, you can go lighter by switching out the 4.3s for the 3.8s, or heavier by switching over the 3.8s for the 4.3s, or you can do your own custom weights. Now for me, I'm not even going to bother to use these because I am not really a fan of roller weights. I've got a set of 19 by 15 Dr. Pulley 4-gram slider weights. So for me, roller weights always wear too quickly, especially tuning weights like these Malossi weights seem to be known to wear pretty quickly. And sliders are very, very good about wear. Sometimes you get a performance gain out of these, sometimes you don't, but they always hold up better for me than rollers do. So I've got these in every single scooter that I own, from the 50cc Tao 4-stroke with no power all the way up to the T-Max 500. So these go in with this flat section here facing up. They're pretty obvious once you've put one or two in. You can just tell by the shape. So gonna go ahead and put those in all the way around. That's pretty much the same starting weight that I would have had with the Malossi weights. Now it is possible that sliders will act differently than rollers. Depends on the Variator from my experience. There are some makes and models where you put sliders in there and you may need heavier sliders than you had rollers, or maybe you need a little lighter sliders. But usually it's heavier that you need. And then there are some that it seems to directly swap back and forth. It doesn't matter if it's rollers or sliders, they work about the same way. So I'm going to try 4 grams, and if my RPM is way off when this thing gets running, then I know I need to go a little heavier or lighter or whatever. The ramp plate needs to be prepped for assembly, so you've got these 3 little guides or bushings here, and these will only go on one way, so they'll slide on like this. But if you tried to put them on backwards, they wouldn't even fit, so that's pretty simple. Just push each one of those on there and make sure they're all the way seated. I will put that on the Variator, and it's a good idea just to make sure that this will move smoothly and freely, which it does. Put some pressure on the ramp plate and the Variator, hold those two together, that way your rollers or sliders can't move around, and then slide this onto the crank. Now the belt needs to be installed, and you should notice that it's got writing and then it's got these arrows facing in one direction. So what I always do is put this on so the arrows are facing the direction of rotation of the belt. So it's going to go, in this case, just like I'm holding it now, I'm just going to flip it up and it's going to go this way. So the belt is rotating around this way, the way the arrows point. To install this, you should be able to take both hands and open this rear pulley up, and while that's open, you can get the belt in there. So once it's open with 2 hands, usually you can hold it enough with one to get the belt in. Alright, so I'm going to kind of work this in there. This is a little bit different than what I'm used to because I've normally got a lot more room to work a belt in, but it looks like you can get it in there. Just be careful, don't force it too hard anywhere. You don't want to damage the belt up against the sharp edges of the case. Now that's in there, and it'll go around the drive boss here on the front pulley. And right now the belt is actually holding the rear pulley open. That's good because I want plenty of slack up here. After I get this all assembled and tighten the nut down, I don't want the belt to be riding right in the center. I want it toward the outer edge, and so you've got to have this slack. You may have noticed earlier that I've got a shim kit here. This is a Naraku shim kit, and basically these are just really, really thin little washers. You can put them on here and it'll essentially extend the length of your drive boss, and that can be good sometimes for fine tuning. I'm not going to use it right now. I'm just going to set it up the way it comes out of the box. So I can go ahead and put my fixed half on here. That should just slide on. And now another part that did not come with the Malossi kit, which is this starter pawl. So you can get these from Piaggio parts dealers or ScooterTuning.Ca. That should, you see it's got 4 little tabs. They will lock into the 4 spots in here, and then it's got splines in the center that match up with the crank. So you've just got to get the 2 of those aligned together and locked in. And when you're installing this, make sure you're keeping your belt out of the way so it's not keeping this pulley from going all the way on. The Variator nut is included from Malossi. You'll actually have 2 in the kit. One works for the Variator, the other works for the flywheel or rotor. I'm going to use a little bit of medium strength thread locker here. And then I can install this nut. And the whole time that you're working with tightening this nut down, you want to always be sure that you have slack up here, because otherwise, if the belt is in the center, you'll tighten the variator up against the belt and you may not actually get the nut tight. This nut should be torqued to 40 to 44 Newton meters, and you're going to need a way to hold this still so that you can torque it. So you're probably going to use one of these pin style spanners like this. And there's a couple of spots here on the drive face where those go. Do not ever just put them against fins. Trust me from experience that will break fins. So in my case, these sort of fit in there. It could definitely be a better fit. I'm not sure if this is going to work out for me or not. And again, 40 to 44 Newton meters is what I'm looking for here. Yeah, I'm definitely going to have to come up with a different tool because my spanner is a little bit large for those spots. Just barely fits and it won't go very deep into there. So I'm going to have to come up with another tool for future use. There we go. Again, once you're done, verify that the belt was not holding anything up. You can see it definitely wasn't in this case. And make sure this does feel tight. There shouldn't be any wiggle in there. Now it's time for everyone's favorite part, which is the CVT cover and specifically the kickstart. So if you ordered the RC1 or C1 kit or you ordered the complete Malossi Air Force CVT cover, then you should have everything that you see here. We'll get started with the part that people seem to like the least about the process, which is this kickstart return spring. The shaft's going to go in, this gear here, and then there is a shim or a washer and a snap ring. So make sure you have snap ring pliers handy nearby that will fit this. Before that's installed, there's a bushing right here in the case, and that should be greased. So I'm just going to go ahead and use the grease that Malossi supplied, or you can use a general purpose wheel bearing grease in there. And you won't need a whole lot, just aiming for a thin coat all the way through. Make sure you wipe off any excess. You don't want whole globs of this in your CVT. If you'd like, you can also smear a little on this shaft as well. Now it's time for the return spring. So first off, got to orient it the right way. It should go like this. You're going to set it down in here. This hook is going to go around this spot on the case. And then you've got this pin facing upward. What needs to happen is this spring, the little peg here, is going to need to rotate around so that it can sit on this gear. So this is how this gear will be at rest, and then when we kick, it's going to go up here like that, and then it needs something to return it. So we've got to get this rotated around until it can sit against this little spot in the gear. And that way when it comes up, it's going to want to pull back, return this way. So the spring is the part that most people don't like dealing with because it can be a little scary, I guess you could say. There's quite a bit of force on this thing, and you've got your fingers all in here, so you got to be really careful with it. Now what I would normally do is take a pair of vice grips. Again, first time on the Piaggio for me, but I've done other similar stuff, so I normally take a pair of vice grips and put them on this little peg here, and I grip it really, really tight. Smallest vice grips I have that I think are substantial enough to hold on to it. Grip super tight, don't want it to come off. And then I would take it and twist it around and then drop my gear in place, and then you can release the vice grips when it's in the right spot. What seems to be popular with other people is to take a small socket, something smaller than this, but something that's fairly close to the size of this pin, and then they'll take that in some sort of tool, a ratchet or a screwdriver handle, whatever they got, and then rotate it around that way, get this all in place, and then you can release it. I saw that there is a specialty tool for this, and I thought I might as well try it out because I've never seen a specialty tool for the kickstarts on the other stuff, and I was just curious to see how it worked. I'm surprised it doesn't say it on here somewhere, but this tool is made by Bozzetti, and it's essentially a big socket with half of it cut away here and just a couple other features. So it's got the drive here for a ratchet, which I believe is 1/2 inch, and then over here you've got a pin, and then there's a hole in it. So the hole in it is going to match up with this pin on the spring. That will go in there. And this pin here, I believe, is supposed to ride on the inside of the spring to kind of help keep it in place, because a lot of times when you're trying to get this thing turned around, you can see even from just this little amount, the spring wants to kind of ride up in the center. So I think that what this pin is doing is trying to keep this from riding up and actually keep everything in place. So this hole is going on top of that pin there, and then this pin needs to be squeezed in to the very inside of the spring. Just like that. So kind of pops in place. Seems to be pretty secure there. Let's see, I'm going to have to turn it counterclockwise. So I've got a ratchet. I'm going to set this to off. Now I've got my ratchet on there, and I've moved over to the edge of my bench because the shaft is going to have to go through that center hole, and there's no room for it up against the workbench. So you need it to be able to fall through. So I'll rotate this around, and I've got to keep pressure on this, because if you don't keep pressure down on here, I think that tool is going to pop out. And also it looks like the spring is still trying to pop up to me. But keeping pressure down, making sure I get this turned around until the pin is over here, kind of facing the front of the CVT cover. I've got my gear. I'm going to put the gear through here and kind of rotate it just a little more. The gear can go down through the center there. There should be enough clearance for this to come through, I hope. Let me rotate this a little more and then try to keep holding it down at the same time. Nope, and it came off. So this is not quite as easy as I would have hoped for a specialty tool. So maybe I'm mistaken, and maybe you're supposed to actually have this installed first. I'm not exactly sure, never done this, like I said. So put that in there, get everything situated. All right. That may be the trick. And now, get my ratchet in there again. I have to kind of hold everything still. Okay, it's rotating that right along with it. Putting some pressure down here. And then, as soon as this gear gets clear, I'll push it down, and then hopefully I should be able to release this tool, just keeping pressure down on there. So, let me make sure you can see. Once I got it around, as soon as this thing would clear this little ledge here, I pushed it straight down all the way in. And now I'm keeping pressure on it, because if I don't keep pressure on it, this is going to spring out. And then I'm going to remove this. I think. Trying to make sure I keep this spring down here, because, let's see, right up here the spring is coming up a bit. I don't want this thing to come out of there. So, being as careful as I can, I'm trying to get this tool out of here. There we go. Gonna keep pressure down on there, don't want anything to come out. And I want to get my spring into place. Just make sure it's not riding up on the center there, so just kind of pry it over. Again, making sure I keep an eye on this. There we go. Now I can flip this over, continuing to hold pressure here. And I've got this shim that will slide on there. Then there's a little groove that's right above that washer if this is in there properly, and the snap ring will need to go in there. There we go. Just got to get it into the groove. Once I think that's finished, I do like to give it a couple of little bumps here, because I want to make sure this is indeed locked in place and doesn't fly out later. Not hitting it hard. But that is in place, nothing moved. Now the kickstart lever can go on, and one thing that I think is pretty neat about the Piaggio design versus Minarelli that I'm used to, 139 QMB, etc., is that they only give you a few teeth on one side, and they are big, much beefier teeth than what I've seen on the splines, so they don't appear to be as delicate. But what's neat about that is some of us, especially years ago, were under the misconception that you could take a kickstart lever and put it up here, and then that would give you a better kick. But actually what happened was it would cause you to break kickstart parts. It's much better off to leave it level. So they actually dictate where this is going to go exactly, because there's only one way this can go on with the way it's set up. So I think that's a pretty good idea. So just align the teeth on there, push that down into place, and then they should have supplied a bolt like this. I'm actually going to put a little bit of thread locker on here before I install it. There is a groove in there, so make sure you get that aligned or it's going to be kind of tough to get the bolt through. And this bolt should be torqued to 12 to 13 Newton meters. And just move the lever, make sure it returns, and everything seems to work smoothly. Now there's this gear that will go into here, just like this. Before it goes in there, a couple of things we need to take care of. This little spring piece here, this kind of spring clip, will need to go around here. And I also want to grease a couple of things. So first, I will put this clip on, but I'm going to put a little bit of grease in this groove where the clip goes. Really, really small amount, just a tiny bit of lubrication. I don't want to have grease just hanging around on here. Now this part of the clip will need to face into the cover there, so it's going to go like this. So you just put it on top of the gear and you'll kind of spread this thing apart with your thumbs. Just get it over top of the gear there and then push it down till it's in that groove. There we go. A little bit of grease here on the shaft. You can also get it in there if you want. I've got enough grease on the shaft there that I think it should be fine. I'm going to start that in there. So I'm just getting the tip of that in, and then I'm going to move the lever a little bit to pull this up, push this down till it mates up with the other gear in there. Once I get it to match up there, eventually, there we go, then it will kind of slide down into place and it should return. Find those two dowels that you should have with a kit, and one's going to go here in this corner. These are not press fit apparently, they just pop right in. And one's going to go up here in this corner. Then I can take the CVT cover, align it with those dowels, and should be able to pop it into place. There we go. Yeah, it's quite snug here. There it goes. Now there are 15 CVT cover bolts that need to be installed, and all of those are going to get torqued to 10 to 11 Newton meters. Just like everything else we've done, try to install them in a crisscross fashion. So many of these things, I'm just going all the way around just the perimeter one at a time. That way I can be 100% sure I didn't miss anything. The finishing touch is this little air filter and scoop kit. So the air filter, you can put it in there if you want, or just put it right around that piece on the case there, on the cover. This piece needs to go in here. I'm going to make mine face downward, so a couple of slots, just slide that right in there. And then that will go right up here like this. Then they give you 3 of these little brass inserts and 2 screws, so you've just got 1 spare brass insert. And all you do is put one of those on each screw. And you've got 2 mounting holes, one here and then one's under here. Don't have a torque spec, so just snug them up with your screwdriver. That's going to do it for this episode. So first I want to say thank you to ScooterTuning.Ca for helping to make this project possible with a discount. And I want to tell you guys that you should also check them out because they have a ton of scooter parts and they're great to deal with. Also, if you've enjoyed the video or found it helpful, then please give it a like. Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell to receive notifications so you don't miss the rest of this project and get to see it go together and how it runs. As always, thank you for watching.